She thought she was just protecting a scared little girl. She didn't know that child was the only daughter of Korea's most ruthless mafia king. In one fearless moment, a weary waitress stood between a predator and a princess and triggered a debt that would pull her from the diner floor into the heart of a criminal empire. Most people in the city knew the name Kim Se-jin and shuddered. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a ghost, a shadow, and the undisputed leader of the city's most powerful syndicate. He was cold, calculated, and carried a reputation for silence that was more terrifying than any threat. To look him in the eye was a mistake. To touch what belonged to him was a death sentence. That afternoon, the diner was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and the hum of a rotating fan. Nia Carter was halfway through a double shift, her feet aching and her mind on her bills. She was a woman who kept her head down and her heart guarded, surviving on grit and no-nonsense patience. But across the room, the mundanity of the afternoon shattered. A man named Lee Dong-hyun, a known predator with a sneer that made Nia's skin crawl, was cornering a 7-year-old girl. Little Kim Ha-eun was trembling, her back against a booth, her eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. The diner was full, but everyone else looked away. They saw the man's expensive suit and his aggressive posture and chose their own safety. Nia didn't look away. Without a second thought, she dropped her tray. No hesitation, no fear for herself, just the raw, protective instinct of a woman who refused to let the innocent be preyed upon. She stepped into the gap, her hand raised like a shield, her body a wall between the girl and the man who meant to harm her. Lee Dong-hyun growled a threat. The air in the diner turned ice cold, but Nia didn't flinch. She stood her ground, unaware that from a dark car parked across the street, a pair of lethal obsidian eyes were watching her every move. In that single heartbeat, a child's safety was secured, and the life of a hard-working waitress was rewritten by the hand of a mafia king.
Nia didn't think about the consequences. She only thought about the trembling. 7-year-old Ha-eun was backed so tightly against the vinyl booth that she seemed to be trying to disappear into the wall. Lee Dong-hyun leaned over her, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and entitlement, his hand reaching out to stroke the child's hair in a way that made the bile rise in Nia's throat. "Hey!" Nia's voice cracked through the diner like a whip. She didn't wait for him to turn. She stepped between them, her body a physical barrier, her hand raised firmly to catch his wrist before it could touch the girl. The diner, usually a symphony of clinking silverware and low chatter, went deathly silent. "The lady is uncomfortable," Nia said, her voice low and steady, despite the adrenaline hammering in her chest. "And you're done here." Dong-hyun's face twisted, his eyes darkening with a dangerous flick of ego. "Do you have any idea who I am, waitress? Move, or you'll be looking for a job in a different city, if you're lucky." Nia didn't budge. Behind her, she felt small, frantic fingers clutch the fabric of her apron. That tiny weight anchored her. "I don't care if you're the mayor. Get out of my diner." Dong-hyun sneered, pulling back his fist as if to strike, but the blow never landed. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Nia's arms stand up. The door to the diner didn't just open, it seemed to yield. A man stepped in, followed by 2 shadows in charcoal suits. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Nia made in a year, his presence so commanding that the rowdy regulars at the counter instinctively ducked their heads. This was Kim Se-jin. His eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian shards, didn't look at the pervert first. They looked at the small hand clutching Nia's apron. Then they moved to Nia. "Appa!" Ha-eun's voice was a broken sob. The transition was instantaneous. Seok-jin's men moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, pinning Dong-hyun against the table before he could even let out a whimper. Seok-jin ignored the man's muffled pleas, walking straight to Naya. He stopped inches away, a towering wall of power and scent, sandalwood and cold rain. He gently pried his daughter from Naya's apron, lifting the girl into his arms. Ha-eun buried her face in his neck, her shaking finally subsiding. Seok-jin's gaze returns to Naya, lingering on her name tag, then on the fearless set of her jaw. You stood when everyone else sat. You protected my blood. In my world, such a debt is never forgotten. It is settled with life for life. Naya swallowed hard, realizing for the first time that the man she had just saved the girl from was the least dangerous person in the room. I was just doing my job, she managed to whisper. Seok-jin stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the small space. No, you were being a shield, and from this moment on, I am yours. The adrenaline from the diner incident had barely faded when the reality of Naya's new life arrived at her doorstep. It was nearly midnight, and the neon sign of the bodega across the street flickered, casting rhythmic blue shadows into her cramped studio apartment. She was reaching for her teapot when the sound of splintering wood shattered the silence. The door didn't just open, it was kicked off its hinges. Two men, their faces obscured by low-brimmed caps and smelling of stale cigarettes and malice, stormed in. They weren't the polished professionals she had seen with Seok-jin. These were scavengers, friends of Lee Dong-hyun, looking to reclaim the pride Naya had stripped away at the diner. One lunged at her, a glint of a switchblade catching the blue neon light, but before he could close the distance, the window behind him exploded inward. A flashbang of precision followed. A single, muffled shot rang out, and the intruder's shoulder blossomed red as he was slammed against the wall by the force of a high-caliber round. The fire escape from the figure stepped through the shattered glass with the grace of a panther. It was the same charcoal-suited enforcer who had stood behind Seok-jin. He didn't look at the bleeding men. He looked only at Naya. Mr. Kim's patience is thin, Miss Carter. He warned you that a debt of blood attracts sharks. You are no longer safe in this world. Minutes later, Naya found herself being ushered into the back of a black sedan. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a small bag of essentials she'd been allowed to grab. The car glided through the city's industrial underbelly, eventually climbing the winding private roads of the Buksan foothills. The gates of the Kim estate were massive, iron-wrought gates topped with cameras and guarded by men who carried assault rifles as casually as umbrellas. As the car pulled into the courtyard, the sheer scale of the fortress hit her. It was a palace built of marble and obsidian, glowing with a soft, predatory light. Kim Seok-jin was waiting at the top of the stone stairs, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lonely figure against the grand entrance. He didn't move as she stepped out of the car, but his gaze swept over her, checking for injuries with a clinical intensity that made her heart skip. "Your apartment is being handled," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "You will stay here, in the East Wing. My daughter is already asking for the woman who saved her." "I can't stay here," Naya whispered, looking at the high walls that felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. "You can," Seok-jin replied, stepping down the stairs until he stood directly in her path. "In this house, you are the most protected woman in Korea. Outside those gates, you are a target. Choose your side, Naya." Looking back at the city lights below, Naya realized the choice had already been made for her the moment she raised her hand in that diner. She followed the king into his castle, leaving the girl she used to be in the shadows of the street.
The East Wing of the Kim estate was a masterpiece of cold, silent luxury. The floors were polished obsidian that mirrored Nia's visitant footsteps, and the walls were draped in hand-painted silk that felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. For a woman who had spent her life measuring time in 15-minute break intervals and tips gathered from sticky formica tables, the opulence was suffocating. Every time a silent maid appeared to offer a tray of hand-pressed juice or a warm towel, Nia felt the urge to apologize for existing in the same space. She spent her first morning staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the manicured gardens, her hands restless without a tray to carry or a table to wipe. The hospitality Seok-jin had promised felt like a gilded detention. She was a woman of action, defined by her labor and her independence, and here she was being treated like a fragile porcelain doll. The silence was finally broken by a soft, rhythmic thumping. Nia followed the sound to the library, where she found Haeun sitting on a plush velvet rug. The little girl was surrounded by a sea of colorful wooden blocks, but she wasn't building anything. She was simply knocking them over, one by one, her expression vacant and her small shoulders hunched. Nia didn't approach like the tutors or the nannies did, with forced cheer and clinical observation. Instead, she sat down on the floor a few feet away, crossing her legs and leaning back against a mahogany bookshelf. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up 2 discarded blocks and started balancing them on her knee. Minutes stretched into an hour. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Haeun slid closer. She watched Nia's clumsy tower collapse, and for the first time, a tiny spark of light touched the girl's eyes. Nia reached out, not to grab the girl, but to offer her a blue block. "I used to build these with my little brother," Nia said softly, her voice a warm contrast to the sterile room. "We didn't have fancy blocks like these. We used old soup cans. They made a much louder noise when they fell." Haeun looked at the block, then at Nia. Her lower lip trembled. The trauma of the diner and the months of living in the shadow of her father's violent world seemed to ripple through her. She reached out, her small fingers brushing Nia's calloused palm as she took the block. Did the cans break?" The voice was tiny, scratchy from disuse, but to Nia it sounded like a victory. She felt a lump form in her throat. Across the room, in the reflection of the glass doors, she saw a shadow move. Seok-jin was standing in the hallway, his usual icy composure wavering as he watched his daughter speak for the first time in weeks. Nia didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Haeun. "No," Nia whispered, smiling. "They were tough, just like us." In that moment, the silk and steel of the estate felt a little less like a cage and a little more like a foundation. Nia realized she wasn't just there for protection, she was there to bring the girl back from the dark. The moon hung low over the Bukhansan peaks, casting long skeletal shadows across the estate's stone courtyard. Unable to sleep in the suffocating silence of her silk-lined room, Nia had wandered out to the ancient ginkgo tree that stood like a sentinel near the edge of the terrace. She found Seok-jin there, his back to her, staring out at the city lights that glittered like a sea of fallen stars. He didn't turn when she approached, but the tension in his shoulders eased ever so slightly. "She hasn't spoken like that in 2 years," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the night wind. "Not since the night the world became a very quiet place for her." Nia leaned against the rough bark of the tree, looking at him. The cold, untouchable Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked weary down to his very soul. "What happened, Seok-jin?" Nia asked. He finally turned, the moonlight catching the jagged scar that ran just beneath his jawline, a physical map of a deeper pain. "Haeun's mother was the light of this house. She was the only person who didn't see me as a weapon." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "My rivals knew that. They didn't come for me, they came for my heart." He described a night of rain and screeching tires, much like the chaos Nia had seen in the diner, but with a far darker ending. A coordinated hit had targeted their car. Seok-jin had been forced to choose between pursuing the attackers or saving his family from the wreckage. He had saved Haeun, pulling her from the twisted metal, but he had been too late for his wife. "I realized then that my love was a curse," Seok-jin continued, his jaw tightening. "The more I cared, the more I put them in danger. So I became the ice everyone expects. I kept Haeun in this fortress, thinking silence was the same as safety."
Then you appeared, a woman with no armor, no guards, and nothing to gain who walked into the fire for a child that wasn't even yours. You showed her that the world isn't just shadows and predators. You gave her back her voice because you weren't afraid to use yours. Nia felt a sudden fierce ache in her chest. She had spent her life thinking that being ordinary meant she had nothing to offer a man like him. But as the wind swirled the fallen ginkgo leaves around their feet, she realized her ordinariness, her simple, stubborn humanity, was the one thing his millions could never buy. "Safety isn't silence, Seok-jin," Nia said softly, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from him. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her cheek, and for a fleeting moment the shadow of his past seemed to retreat before the light of her presence.
The sanctuary of the estate had begun to feel like a second skin, but Nia knew that even the most beautiful cage was still a cage. After days of silk and shadows, she convinced Seok-jin to let her visit the local market to buy specialized ingredients for a meal she wanted to cook for Hyun. Seok-jin had hesitated, his eyes darkening with an old, familiar instinct, but eventually relented on one condition: 2 of his best men would follow her at a distance. The air outside the gates was sharp and crisp, a reminder of the world Nia had left behind. For an hour, she lost herself in the vibrant chaos of the open-air market, the smell of roasted nuts and the haggling of vendors grounding her. But as she turned into a quieter alleyway to reach a specific spice shop, the atmosphere shifted. The bustle of the crowd seemed to mute, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on gravel. She didn't need to look back to know the sharks had found her. "Going somewhere, waitress?" The voice was jagged, filled with the bitterness of bruised egos. From behind a stack of crates, 3 men emerged. They weren't dressed in the fine wool of the Kim syndicate. They wore the tracksuits and heavy chains of the street-level thugs associated with Lee Dong-hyun. Nia clutched her grocery bag, her knuckles white. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The lead man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The mistake was yours. You made our boss look like a joke. Now we're going to see how much the Mafia prince is willing to pay to get his little pet back." Before Nia could react, they lunged. She swung her heavy bag of groceries, the weight of the glass jars catching the first man across the jaw, but the others were too fast. One grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back, while the third produced a cloth soaked in a chemical scent that made her head swim. Nia fought with every ounce of grit she possessed, her heels digging into the dirt, but the world began to tilt. Just as the blackness threatened to take her, a series of muffled thuds echoed through the alleyway. Her captors suddenly went limp, falling away like cut puppets. Through the haze, she saw the 2 shadows Seok-jin had sent. They moved with a lethal, terrifying precision that Nia had only ever imagined. Within seconds, the alley was silent again, the kidnappers neutralized before they could even scream. One of the guards reached out to steady her, his face an unreadable mask of efficiency. "The car is around the corner, Miss Carter. Mr. Kim is already on his way." As she was ushered back toward the safety of the iron gates, Nia felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just a guest. She was a target, a piece on a chessboard she didn't fully understand. And as the first time, she realized that being loved by a king meant living in the sights of his enemies. The air inside the estate's private office was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and a cold metallic tension that Nia could feel in her teeth. She stood by the heavy oak doors, her pulse still erratic from the afternoon's brush with kidnapping. Across the room, Seok-jin was no longer the grieving widower or the gentle father she had glimpsed under the ginkgo tree. He was the blood prince, a man whose mercy was a finite resource that had just run dry.
In the center of the room, Lee Dong-hyun and the men from the alleyway were forced to their knees. They were no longer the cocky predators of the street. They were broken, trembling shadows of men, their faces pale under the harsh glow of the chandelier. Seok-jin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He moved among them with a predatory grace, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug. "I gave a command," Seok-jin said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that vibrated through the floorboards. "I stated that the woman who saved my daughter was under my protection. To touch her is to strike at me. To terrify her is to invite a darkness you cannot imagine." He stopped in front of Dong-hyun, tilting his chin up with the toe of his polished leather shoe. The sheer coldness in Seok-jin's eyes was a revelation to Naya. This was the foundation of his empire. Not just wealth, but a calculated, absolute ruthlessness that ensured his survival. Naya watched, her breath hitching, as Seok-jin signaled to his enforcers. He didn't look away as the consequences were meted out, not with mindless violence, but with a clinical, systematic stripping of everything these men held dear. Their businesses, their connections, their safety, all vanished with a few quiet words from a man who ruled from the shadows. When the men were dragged out, sobbing and broken, Seok-jin finally turned to Naya. The mask didn't slip immediately. For a moment, she saw the monster the city whispered about, the man who could dismantle lives without blinking. It terrified her, a primal warning bell ringing in her mind. But as he stepped toward her, his gaze softened, the lethal edge receding just enough to let the man beneath breathe. "You should not have seen that," he murmured, his hand hovering near her waist, hesitant to touch her after what his hands were capable of. "I needed to see it," Naya replied, her voice shaky but honest. "I needed to know who you really are." She was terrified, yes, but she was also deeply, dangerously intrigued. She realized then that Seok-jin wasn't a hero in a fairy tale. He was a king in a war. And as he reached out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear, his touch was impossibly light, a stark contrast to the destruction he had just unleashed. She saw the duality of the man, the beast who protected the den and the father who loved the cub. And for the first time, she wondered if she was strong enough to love both.
The heavy silence that had governed the Kim estate for years began to fracture under the smell of sizzling bacon and the rhythmic clinking of a whisk against a ceramic bowl. Naya had grown tired of the silent, multi-course meals served by stone-faced staff in the formal dining room. To her, a home wasn't defined by the height of its ceilings, but by the warmth of its kitchen. She took over the expansive, professional-grade kitchen on a Saturday morning, rolling up her sleeves and tying a simple linen apron over her clothes. When Seok-jin appeared in the doorway, his silk tie loosened and his expression guarded, he found his daughter standing on a wooden stool, her face smudged with flour and a wide, genuine grin on her face. "The kitchen is for the staff, Naya," Seok-jin said, though his voice lacked its usual bite of authority. "The kitchen is for whoever is hungry," Naya countered, pointing a wooden spoon at him, "and right now, your daughter is learning the secret to the perfect pancake flip. Sit down, Mr. Kim, you're off the clock." Reluctantly, the man who controlled the city's underworld sat at the breakfast bar. Naya set a mismatched mug of coffee in front of him, not the expensive espresso he was used to, but the strong, dark roast she used to serve at 6 a.m. to truckers and night shift nurses. As the morning unfolded, the diner magic took hold. Naya didn't just feed them, she made them participate. She taught Seok-jin how to crack an egg without getting shells in the batter, laughing when the feared Mafia boss looked more nervous about a yolk breaking than he did about a rival syndicate. She encouraged Hyen to decorate the pancakes with fruit, turning the meal into a messy, colorful masterpiece. For the first time, the tension that usually lived in Seok-jin's jaw seemed to dissolve. He watched Naya move, efficient, warm, and entirely unimpressed by his status. She treated him like a man, not a myth. When Hyan accidentally spilled a glass of juice, she didn't freeze in fear. She reached for a rag and laughed when Naya made a joke about it being a flavor explosion. In the low light of the kitchen, surrounded by the mundane sounds of a family breakfast, the shadows of the past felt miles away. Siak Jin reached across the counter, his hand brushing Naya's as he reached for the syrup. His eyes lingered on hers, no longer cold or calculating, but filled with a quiet, burgeoning wonder. "You've turned my fortress into a diner," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I've turned your house into a home," Naya corrected softly. "There's a difference." As they ate together, not as a boss, a waitress, and a ward, but as three people tied by an emerging bond, Naya realized that the most powerful thing she had brought into this world of violence wasn't her protection, but her normalcy. She was teaching the king that he didn't have to be a statue to be a leader, and she was teaching the child that life could be sweet, one pancake at a time. The peace of the diner morning was shattered 3 nights later by the sound of a controlled explosion at the perimeter. The estate's alarms didn't just wail, they vibrated through the floorboards like a heartbeat skipping. Within seconds, the warm, flour-dusted kitchen was replaced by the cold reality of a fortress under siege. Lee Dong-hyun, backed by a desperate rival syndicate, had launched a final, suicidal breach. They weren't looking for a payoff anymore. They were looking for blood. "Naya, take Hyan to the safe room. Do not open it for anyone but me," Siak Jin commanded, his eyes returning to that obsidian hardness. He checked the slide on his weapon with a grim finality. "Go." Naya scooped up the trembling girl and ran, but as they reached the reinforced hallway of the east wing, they saw the breach. A section of the wall had been blown inward, and through the smoke, 2 men were climbing through the debris. They were past the primary guards. They were between Naya and the safe room. "Stay behind me, Naya," Naya whispered, her voice a low anchor in the chaos. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have the training of a soldier, but she had the instincts of a woman who had survived the streets and a life of hard work. As the first intruder lunged, Naya didn't flee. She grabbed a heavy bronze decorative bust from a pedestal and swung with the full force of her shoulders. The weight of the metal connected with the man's temple, sending him crashing into the marble floor. The second man leveled a pistol, but Naya was already moving. She shoved a heavy oak display case in his path, the glass shattering and creating a barrier of jagged shards and splinters. As he stumbled, she tackled him with raw, unadulterated fury. They crashed into the wall, Naya's hands clawing at the weapon, her mind focused on one thing, the child standing 10 feet away. She was pinned, the man's hand tightening around her throat, but Naya reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy steel kitchen shears she'd kept there since the market incident. She drove the handle into the man's ribs, gasping for air as he buckled. She didn't stop until he was disarmed and neutralized, her breathing ragged and her apron stained with dust and crimson. When Siak Jin burst into the hallway minutes later, his men trailing behind him, he stopped dead. He expected to find a victim. Instead, he found a guardian. Naya stood over the fallen intruders, her hair wild and her gaze lethal, shielding a sobbing but unharmed Hyan. Siak Jin stepped over the debris, his hands shaking as he reached for her. He realized then that he hadn't just brought a waitress into his house, he had brought a lioness. His guns held the perimeter, but Naya's spirit had held the heart of the home. In the wreckage of the hallway, the power dynamic shifted forever. She wasn't just a woman he protected, she was the only person in the world capable of standing beside him. 1 year later, the neon hum of the diner and the smell of burnt coffee felt like memories from a different lifetime. The iron gates of the Kim estate no longer felt like the bars of a cage, but the boundaries of a sanctuary Nia had helped build. She stood on the grand balcony overlooking the city, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk. Her posture is steady and commanding as the marble pillars behind her. The city below still whispered the name Kim Seok-jin with fear, but they spoke of the woman beside him with a different kind of reverence. Nia wasn't just a guest or a protected witness anymore. She was the heartbeat of the syndicate. She had implemented reforms that favored the community, turning the family's vast resources toward the neighborhoods they once only ruled, proving that power was most effective when it was coupled with a conscience. A soft tug at her hand brought her back to the present. Hyan, taller and vibrant with life, stood beside her. The silence that had once haunted the girl was long gone, replaced by laughter and a sharp, inquisitive mind. Hyan looked up at Nia with eyes full of adoration, not for a waitress who had saved her once, but for the woman who had stayed to raise her. "Appa is waiting," Hyan whispered, pointing toward the courtyard where a formal dinner was prepared under the ancient ginkgo tree. Seok-jin stood by the table, his obsidian eyes softening the moment they landed on Nia. He had traded his cold, impenetrable mask for a look of profound peace. As Nia approached, he reached out, his hand sliding into hers with a familiarity that spoke of 1,000 shared secrets and survived storms. "The city is quiet tonight," Seok-jin murmured, pulling her close. "Because they know who's watching over them," Nia replied, her voice filled with the quiet strength that had once defined her at a diner booth and now defined her at the head of an empire. Seok-jin reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring, not a blood debt or a mark of ownership, but a promise. "1 year ago, you saved my daughter. Today, I'm asking if you'll keep saving me truly, Nia, as my wife, as the mother of this family." Nia looked from the man she loved to the girl who had become her world. She thought of the nobody in the faded apron and realized that she hadn't just survived a dangerous world, she had conquered it by refusing to let it change her heart. "Yes," she breathed, the word carrying the weight of her new destiny. As they sat down to dinner, the city lights sparkled below like a sea of possibilities. The waitress was gone, and the matriarch had arisen. Nia Carter had walked into a world of shadows, and with nothing but courage and a raised hand, had led a king and his cub into the light.